Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're stepping into one of the most chilling and unexplained family tragedies from 1853 Arkansas. The Ravenscar family was known for wealth, power, and influence, but behind the walls of their grand house something dark was growing, something that would turn their home into a living nightmare. This is the story of a house that seemed to consume its own bloodline, leaving behind rumors, shadows, and questions no one could ever answer. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure you subscribe, because every story here comes from long hours of digging through forgotten archives, rare testimonies, and true historical traces that take real effort to uncover. The Ravenscar house stood deep within the Arkansas woods, far from any neighboring home, and its isolation made it feel more like a forgotten monument than a family estate. The long dirt road that led to it twisted through dense trees and thick shadows, so that visitors often said they felt watched long before they reached the front door. The structure itself rose above the land with sharp angles and tall narrow windows that never seemed meant to let in light. Its walls were built from dark stone that absorbed the sun and gave the house a cold, lifeless appearance. No matter the season, the architecture felt unnatural, as if different builders had forced mismatched styles together. Inside, the layout made little sense, with hallways that dead-ended at blank walls and staircases that led to rooms with no obvious purpose. The floors creaked even when untouched, and the air carried a heavy stillness that made every corner feel like it was hiding something alive and listening. Visitors who stepped inside often reported feeling lost, even though the house was not large enough to justify the confusion. Some rooms were perfectly polished while others were left unfinished, as if the builders had walked away mid-work and never returned, and the family refused to explain why certain areas stayed sealed off year after year. At night, the exterior of the house looked even more unsettling, with the windows reflecting no light from inside and the surrounding trees leaning in as though drawn to its darkness. The people of Arkansas spoke quietly about it, saying the house felt hungry, as if it waited for those who lived under its roof to finally belong to it forever. The decline of the Ravenscar family began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Despite the wealth that once kept their estate thriving, their business dealings had always been stable, and their land produced more than enough to support their lifestyle. Yet neighbors started noticing that the family no longer hosted gatherings or attended community events that had been tradition for years. The once lively household grew silent and withdrawn, as though something inside its walls had dimmed their spirit. Day by day, the family's finances, which had seemed untouchable, began to unravel without any clear reason. Accounts that were once overflowing started to empty, and workers who had been loyal for decades stopped receiving wages on time. Some claimed the father spent long nights locked in his study, pacing back and forth while muttering about numbers that refused to add up, while others whispered that important documents had gone missing from the safe without signs of forced entry. The children, who had always been seen playing in the yard, suddenly stopped appearing outside. Their laughter faded, their routines changed, and their previously bright personalities grew dull, as if they were carrying burdens far too heavy for their young minds. Teachers in the nearby town said the children's behavior had shifted dramatically, showing signs of exhaustion, fear, and distraction, though none of them would ever say why. The mother, who had been known for her composed and graceful presence, was seen wandering the halls at odd hours of the night, looking pale and sleep-deprived. Servants claimed she jumped at every small sound and refused to enter certain rooms, insisting that The air inside felt wrong, and that the walls seemed to watch her when she passed by. Her confidence shattered and her health deteriorated with no explanation, the decline accelerating with each passing week. As the family's emotional and financial stability crumbled, so did their relationships with one another. Conversations turned into arguments, meals were taken in separate rooms, and a silence settled over the home thick enough to unsettle anyone who stepped inside. It became clear to those observing from afar that whatever was draining the Ravenscar family was coming from within the house itself, pulling them deeper into a darkness no amount of wealth or influence could protect them from. Neighbors living near the Ravenscar property were the first to notice the strange noises drifting from the house late at night, sounds that did not belong to any ordinary family home. At first it was dismissed as wind pushing through the thick Arkansas woods or animals moving through the brush, but the noises grew too distinct, too rhythmic, and too deliberate to ignore. People swore they heard heavy footsteps pacing across the upper floors long after the family had gone quiet for the night, and on some evenings the echoes sounded like furniture being dragged across wooden floors, even though no one ever saw anything move. The next morning, as weeks passed, the sounds became sharper and more unsettling. Neighbors riding past the estate at dusk heard muffled voices arguing, followed by sudden silence, as if the walls themselves swallowed every word. Some claimed they heard a deep, low groaning coming from the side of the house closest to the woods, a sound too heavy to belong to any person and too slow to resemble an animal. One man reported hearing a child screaming, and when he went to alert the family, the entire house appeared silent, dark, and empty except for a single flicker of light in an upstairs window that vanished as soon as he approached. The noises during the daytime were just as disturbing, though far more subtle. Servants who worked in the house whispered that doors opened on their own and that faint tapping echoed from the walls while they cleaned rooms that had been empty for hours. On some afternoons laughter could be heard drifting down the hallway, but it was never the laughter of a child or adult, rather something small, echoing and distorted, like it came from behind the walls instead of inside the room. The servants tried to convince themselves it was the old structure settling, but even they admitted the sounds felt purposeful, like something wanted to be heard. Travelers passing on horseback often slowed down as they neared the Ravenscar property because the house emitted strange vibrations that seemed to travel through the ground itself. The porch would creak even with no one standing on it, and branches near the windows swayed without any wind. Visitors described the odd sensation that the house was breathing, not steadily but with irregular shudders, like something alive trapped inside its stone frame trying to escape, or perhaps waiting for someone to come closer. The more the neighbors listened, the more convinced they became that the house was hiding something deep within its walls, something restless that never slept. The Ravenscar family offered no explanations and refused to acknowledge any of the concerns, leaving the community with only rumors and unsettling observations. Over time, the noises stopped being dismissed as imagination and became a warning sign, a chilling reminder that whatever was happening inside that house was growing louder, stronger, and dangerously more real. The disappearance of the Ravenscar family's eldest son began on a quiet morning when the house seemed unusually still, as if it were holding its breath. He was known to wake early and help with tasks around the estate, but on that day he never appeared in the yard or the stables where he normally spent the first hours of dawn. At first his parents assumed he had overslept or wandered off into the woods, as he sometimes did when he wanted to be alone, but as the hours passed, the worry in the household grew heavier. When the servants searched his room, they found his bed perfectly made and his shoes placed neatly beside it as if he had vanished without ever touching the floor. the family organized a search across the property, starting with the woods that bordered the estate. Men walked the trails calling his name while others checked the barn's sheds and nearby riverbank, but there was no sign of him anywhere. There were no tracks, no torn clothing, no disturbed soil, nothing that suggested he had run away, struggled with someone, or even left the house at all. Dogs brought in to help the search became agitated at the edge of the property, refusing to go near the house as if something inside repelled them. Their refusal made some neighbors whisper that whatever had happened to the boy had happened within the walls of the Ravenscar home. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew suffocating with tension. The mother fell into a silent panic, pacing from room to room as if she expected him to simply step out of a shadow at any moment. The father tore through drawers and locked cabinets, searching for any clue, but instead found odd things he couldn't explain: small muddy footprints on the upstairs landing, a window unlatched despite being sealed the night before, and a faint trail of dust leading to a locked attic door the family hadn't used for years. When he opened it, the room was empty, cold and still, yet the air smelled faintly of the son's favorite cedar soap. By the second night, the house seemed to come alive with unsettling sounds that hadn't been heard before. Soft footsteps echoed above the bedrooms, though no one was upstairs, and faint knocking came from within the walls, like someone trying to call for help from a hidden space. The family tried to dismiss the noises as nerves and grief, but the timing felt too precise, too deliberate. The mother claimed she heard her son whisper her name from the end of the hallway, but when she hurried toward the sound, the hallway stretched unnaturally long and dark, as if the house itself was shifting around her. She refused to sleep after that, convinced that something inside the house knew exactly what had happened to her child. As days turned into weeks, the family was forced to accept that the eldest son was gone without explanation, leaving behind a hole in the household that could not be filled. Neighbors believed he had been taken by someone or something that did not leave marks or tracks, but left behind a chilling sense of dread. The Ravenscar home became a place people avoided at all costs, and the disappearance of the eldest son became the first undeniable sign that the house was not just cursed, it was hungry. The mother's descent into paranoia began slowly at first, when she started noticing small changes in the house that no one else seemed to see: tiny shifts in shadows, faint movements in empty rooms, and the feeling of being watched even when she was alone. She tried to convince herself it was stress from her son's disappearance, but the unease kept growing until it wrapped around her daily life like a tightening coil. At night she would sit upright in bed, listening to the creaks and whispers drifting through the hallways, certain that something inside the house was trying to speak to her or warn her of something far worse. Her appearance began to change as sleepless nights carved dark circles under her eyes, and her once steady hands trembled whenever she reached for a door handle or lit a lantern. Servants noticed she had begun checking the locks on every window, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in a single hour. She avoided mirrors, claiming she saw someone standing behind her even when she was alone in the room, and she insisted that certain parts of the house felt colder than the rest, not because of drafts but because of something unseen passing through them. During meals she barely spoke, pushing her food around her plate while her eyes darted toward the ceiling as though she could hear footsteps above her even when the house was empty. The father tried to calm her, telling her she was imagining things, but she grew angry at his dismissals, insisting that the house had changed since their son vanished, that the walls carried sounds that did not belong to any living person. She told him she felt her son's presence wandering the upstairs hallway, but his presence felt wrong, as if whatever was walking there wore his voice but not his soul. her paranoia deepened when she started finding objects that belonged to her son placed in odd locations: a glove on the staircase, a book lying open in the pantry, a hand-carved toy sitting at the foot of her bed. No one admitted to moving them, and she knew she had not touched them herself. She became convinced the house was returning pieces of her son to her one by one, as if mocking her grief. She refused to enter the attic or the cellar, insisting that something breathed in the darkness there and that if she set foot inside she would not come out again. By the end of the month her fear had grown into a constant trembling that never left her even during the day. She began wandering the halls, whispering to herself, begging the house to leave her alone or to give her back her son if it had taken him. She stopped trusting her own memory, believing the rooms shifted when she turned her back and that doorways stretched a little longer every time she walked through them. To the servants her paranoia looked like madness, but those who had heard the strange noises at night quietly wondered if she had simply become the first to recognize what the Ravenscar house truly was: a place that fed on fear and crumbled the mind long before it claimed the body. The first signs that the servants were preparing to flee appeared in subtle ways as they moved through the halls with downcast eyes and stiff shoulders, as though the weight of the house pressed down on them with every step. They whispered to each other only when they thought no one was listening and avoided being alone in any room for more than a moment. At night they gathered in small groups near the kitchen fire, refusing to separate until dawn because they claimed the upper floors made strange breathing noises after dark and the walls seemed to shift like something alive beneath the plaster. One young maid said she felt a hand brush against her back while she was dusting the stair rail, even though no one was near her. Another claimed she heard someone whisper her name from behind the bedroom door she was cleaning, yet when she opened it the room was empty and colder than any other part of the house. These small moments began stacking up until the servants could no longer dismiss them as tricks of the mind. They grew pale and jumpy, and their work became rushed and careless, as if they were only trying to finish tasks quickly enough to escape the rooms that frightened them. As the days passed, several servants started refusing to enter certain parts of the house altogether. They would not go near the nursery after the eldest son vanished, saying the toys moved on their own and the rocking chair swayed slowly even when the windows were shut. They also avoided the attic staircase because they swore they heard soft footsteps above them whenever they passed by, as if someone or something waited there unseen. The father grew angry at their fear, insisting they were imagining things, but the servants exchanged knowing looks that only deepened his frustration. The final breaking point came on a stormy night when the house groaned under the pressure of the wind, and several servants racing down the hallway claimed they saw a dark shape cross from one room to another without making a sound. They described it as a shadow that did not match the outline of any person in the house and insisted it moved with a purpose that chilled them to the bone. When they tried to speak of it to the mother, she stared at them with wide hollow eyes and whispered that she had seen it too, walking past her bedroom door just hours before. By the next morning the servants packed their belongings with trembling hands, leaving behind most of what they owned in their haste to escape. They slipped away without notice, refusing to wait for payment or permission. Some ran down the road until the house was far out of sight, while others refused to speak of what they had experienced ever again. The Ravenscar home stood emptier and quieter than ever, yet the silence felt heavier, not lighter, as if the house had simply driven out everyone it no longer needed and was preparing to turn its attention fully to the family still trapped inside. The father's decision to seal certain rooms came after weeks of strange incidents that he could no longer rationalize, even with his stubborn refusal to believe in anything supernatural. He began to notice that every unsettling event seemed to trace back to specific parts of the house, areas where the air felt heavier, the floors creaked more loudly, and the shadows clung to the walls as though they had weight. At first he tried to ignore it, telling himself the house was simply old and his imagination was strained from grief, but one night he found a door standing wide open even though he had locked it himself earlier, and something about the stillness inside made his skin crawl. He started with the oldest room in the house, a narrow space near the back hallway with warped wallpaper and a window that never opened no matter how hard anyone pulled. He hammered wooden boards across the door, claiming the room was unsafe due to structural damage, but the servants knew better because they had heard faint tapping coming from inside long before he sealed it. The father kept his hands steady as he worked, but his face was pale and tight, as if he feared something might push back from the other side at any moment. After that he moved to the second floor, where an unused bedroom had become unbearably cold despite the fireplace being intact. He nailed that door shut too, ignoring the mother's protests that their son had once slept in that room and that blocking it off felt like erasing him permanently. But the father insisted it was necessary, saying the air in the room made him dizzy every time he stepped inside. He refused to admit that the dizziness felt less like illness and more like a warning, a presence pushing him out. The final room he sealed was the hallway closet near the attic stairs, a small space barely large enough to hold a few coats, yet somehow it had begun to emit a faint rhythmic sound like slow breathing behind the wooden door. He waited until everyone in the house was asleep before taking his tools upstairs and boarding it shut layer by layer, listening to the sound grow quieter with each nail he drove in. By the time he finished, the hallway was silent, but he felt no relief, only the unsettling sense that whatever had been inside had not disappeared, it had merely shifted somewhere else in the house. When the sun rose the next morning, the house felt strangely unbalanced, as though the boarded rooms had changed the structure's very heartbeat. The father walked through the halls with a tense determination, checking each sealed door as if expecting them to crack open again. The mother avoided those areas entirely, saying the energy around them felt wrong, and the remaining servants kept their distance, whispering that the father had made a mistake. Instead of trapping the darkness, he had only angered it, and the house seemed to grow more restless now that several parts of it were shut away from the living. Local rumors about the Ravenscar land began long before the family ever built their grand house there, and those whispers only grew louder as tragedy tightened around them. The older residents of the nearby town claimed the land had once belonged to a reclusive trapper who vanished without explanation, leaving behind only a cabin that collapsed within a year as though the earth had swallowed it. Travelers who passed through the area said the woods felt strangely silent, as if birds and animals avoided the place completely, and many swore that even the wind changed direction when it neared the property. These stories had been dismissed for years until the Ravenscar family began suffering a series of misfortunes that mirrored the old tales, a pattern too unsettling to ignore. As the family's difficulties grew, neighbors whispered that the land carried a curse born from a violent past. Some believed an earlier family who lived there had been driven mad by isolation, turning on one another until none survived, though no records remained to prove it. Others told stories of an illness that once swept through a small settlement near the same patch of ground, killing dozens within days and leaving the survivors too terrified to return. Whether truth or folklore, the idea that the land itself rejected its inhabitants took hold of the community, and many began to avoid even riding near the Ravenscar property after dusk. More superstitious locals claimed the land was marked by something far older than human history, something hidden beneath the soil that stirred whenever people tried to live on top of it. Hunters spoke about finding strange circular patterns in the dirt near the tree, patterns too smooth to be natural yet too crude to be man-made. There were also accounts of distant humming sounds at night, vibrations that traveled through the ground and made horses skittish. These unsettling signs fueled the belief that the property was never meant to be disturbed, and that the Ravenscars had unknowingly awakened something the moment they laid their foundation. As the family's tragedies multiplied, the townspeople began connecting each incident to the land's past almost as a way to make sense of the chaos. The disappearance of the eldest son, the mother's unraveling, and the servants fleeing all seemed to fit the old stories of families who had once tried to settle on the same ground only to fall apart from within. They said the house was not consuming the family out of malice but out of inevitability, that the soil beneath the foundation demanded a price for being disturbed. The more the Ravenscars fought their fate, the stronger the curse seemed to tighten around them. Eventually the rumors gelled into one chilling belief that spread through the community like wildfire: the land did not simply hold a curse, it chose its victims. And by building their home on that isolated patch of earth, the Ravenscars had unknowingly bound themselves to a fate far older and far darker than any living soul could comprehend. The townspeople watched from a safe distance, knowing there was nothing to be done, because once the land claimed a family, it never released them until the final breath was taken and the house stood silent once more. The household began to sense that something around her no longer followed the rules of ordinary life. Small objects shifted places during the night even though no one admitted touching them. Doors that had been shut tight at dusk were found slightly open by sunrise, letting in a cold draft that felt heavier than air. People tried to explain these moments as mistakes, but every explanation sounded thinner than the silence that followed. It became clear that something unseen was beginning to shape the rhythm of the home. Servants whispered about shadows that lingered in corners long after the light should have pushed them away. They claimed that the girl often stood in those dark pockets as if she was speaking to someone that the rest of the world could not observe. Each time a witness mentioned it, she acted as though she had no memory of doing so, which only deepened the worry. These sightings grew more frequent, and each one pushed people further from sleep. The sense of dread grew heavier each passing day. Nights became more unbearable when faint footsteps echoed through empty hallways. They sounded too soft to belong to a grown person, yet too steady to match the steps of a child. No matter how many times someone got up to investigate, the halls were always empty and still. People began avoiding moving alone in the dark because every shadow seemed to stretch toward them with slow, measured intention. The fear inside the house became like a second presence that breathed alongside its inhabitants. The animals on the property reacted first, showing signs that something unnatural had settled in. Horses refused to approach certain areas even when pulled by force. Dogs growled at corners where nothing stood and then backed away with their tails tucked as if warning of something that the human eye could not catch. Their behavior shook the adults more than the whispers did, because animals were known to sense danger long before people understood it. The atmosphere around the home thickened until every sound felt heavier than before. As the strange moments grew stronger, the residents realized that whatever was clinging to her was no longer hiding. It seemed to move with her, linger near her, and feed on every moment of fear that spread through the household. No matter how much they tried to ignore it, they could not escape the feeling that something beyond human understanding had laid its claim on the home. Each day the boundary between the natural world and the unknown stretched thinner, turning the house into a place where normal rules no longer held firm. By the final night, the Ravenscar house had grown heavy with silence that pressed against the walls as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. Every family member felt the weight differently, the mother pacing from room to room whispering to herself, while the father sat rigid in his study unable to focus on ledgers or papers, and the remaining children huddled together in the largest bedroom trembling with anticipation. The house seemed to pulse in rhythm with their fears, shifting its air thick and cold in ways that could not be explained. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the floors and corners, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed across rooms that should have been empty. Neighbors peering from a distance could see candlelight flickering in windows, yet there was no figure visible inside. Some swore they could hear the low murmur of voices in strange cadences rising and falling, as if the family were conversing with something unseen. Those who had passed the property for decades described an unnatural stillness in the woods surrounding the house, like the trees themselves recoiled from what was happening inside. Even animals that had once grazed peacefully nearby refused to approach, their heads snapping toward the windows as though expecting something to emerge. When morning came, the first discovery was made by a neighbor who had braved the night to check on the family. The front door stood ajar, and inside the house was eerily silent. Not a single sound of movement or life remained. Chairs sat untouched and meals left half prepared on tables, but there was no trace of the family in any room. Certain rooms that had always been locked or sealed were now open, their contents disturbed, suggesting the family had been moved or had vanished into the house itself. The aftermath revealed the family in conditions that defied logic. Some members were found collapsed in their beds, pale and unmoving, while others were discovered in strange positions across hallways and staircases, as if they had tried to escape the invisible force that dominated the house. There were no signs of violence, no injuries, nothing that could explain why the family had become incapacitated or where their will to move had gone. Those who examined the room spoke of a palpable tension in the air, an oppressive presence that seemed to linger even after the bodies had been found. The event became a defining moment for the legend of the Ravenscar home. Word spread quickly through the town and neighboring counties that the house had consumed the family, leaving behind only questions and a growing fear of the property. Locals refused to approach it for years afterward, claiming the house still carried the memory of that night, and anyone who dared enter reported a sense of being watched and followed by something invisible. The mystery cemented itself in the collective memory, ensuring that the tale of the Ravenscar family would haunt Arkansas history indefinitely. The legend of the Ravenscar home lingered long after the family's disappearance and quickly became a tale whispered among neighbors and travelers who dared pass through the area. Stories circulated of people seeing lights flickering in empty windows at night and hearing distant footsteps echoing through the halls when no one had entered the property for years. Some claimed the house seemed to watch them, the shadows shifting as if aware of every movement, and even the bravest hunters who entered the grounds often left early, pale and unnerved, refusing to speak of what they had encountered. Over time, the property gained a reputation for being cursed and dangerous. Children were warned to stay away, and adults avoided taking shortcuts through the wooded paths near the house. The land itself seemed to respond to human presence, with animals refusing to approach and plants near the foundations growing in strange twisted patterns. Locals told tales of faint whispering carried on the wind at night, as though the house itself was speaking, recounting the horrors of the Ravenscar family and ensuring the story would not be forgotten. Attempts to rebuild or repurpose the estate ended in failure. Anyone who tried to renovate the home or occupy the property reported unexplained accidents and feelings of suffocating dread that made work impossible. Foundations would crack, walls would shift, and equipment would mysteriously disappear. Each failure reinforced the belief that the house had its own will, an intelligence born of its long history of tragedy, and that no living soul could hope to reclaim or tame it. The memory of the Ravenscar family became inseparable from the structure itself. Travelers and historians visiting the area often described the house as if it were alive, a presence that loomed over the landscape and carried the weight of its past horrors. The townspeople maintained their distance, recounting the events in hushed tones as a warning that some places are better left untouched and that certain tragedies leave echoes that persist far longer than any living witness. By the end of the century, the Ravenscar house had achieved near mythical status. Writers, storytellers, and curious wanderers contributed to the growing lore, embellishing details and expanding the tale into a legend that survived generations. Its legacy was not just the family it consumed but the fear it instilled and the reminder that some homes are not merely buildings but vessels of history, darkness, and memories that refuse to die. The Ravenscar house remained a haunting symbol, a cautionary story of what happens when a home devours its own and leaves the world to wonder what truly lies within its walls. The aftermath of the Ravenscar tragedy grew even more unsettling as new generations attempted to uncover the truth behind what happened within the walls of the house that devoured its own. Researchers, explorers, and curious travelers arrived hoping to find logical explanations, but many left with trembling hands, saying the deeper they went the more the house seemed to respond to their presence. Some reported feeling sudden drops in temperature or glimpsing movement behind doorways that should have been empty, while others said the silence inside the house felt alive as if listening to every breath. These accounts only strengthened the belief that the Ravenscar home had absorbed something dark from the events of 1853 and that whatever lived there now was more than just old memories. Local historians who attempted to piece together the timeline of the family's downfall found themselves facing conflicting stories, missing documents, and strangely altered records. Ledger books kept by the father contained pages that appeared to have been rewritten by different hands, and maps of the property changed subtly over the years as though the land itself had shifted beneath the house. Even more mysterious was the discovery of old journals from distant relatives describing dreams of the Ravenscar home despite never having set foot in Arkansas. These dreams often involved long hallways stretching into darkness and soft footsteps following behind them which they could never outrun. Those who spent time examining the structure noticed disturbing details too precise to ignore. The wooden beams were carved with deep marks resembling scratches made by human fingernails, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. Floorboards seemed warped in patterns that did not follow natural aging, and in certain rooms any object left overnight would be found moved to the opposite side by morning. Some investigators believe the house retained traces of the fear and suffering of the Ravenscar family, causing it to react to anyone who entered as if reenacting its past. Over the decades, the legend of the house grew beyond its physical structure and became tied to the identity of the surrounding region. Travelers approaching Arkansas claimed they could sense the shift in atmosphere miles before reaching the Ravenscar property, and old families in nearby towns told stories of lights appearing in their own homes when the wind blew from the direction of the ruins. Rumors spread that the land was marked forever by what had happened, and that the house had become a beacon for those who carried their own secrets, drawing them in with a silent promise that it would keep their truths hidden, just as it had kept the truth of the Ravenscar family locked away. By the early 20th century, the house was no longer just a tragedy but a symbol of a curse tied to the events of 1853 that no one could escape or fully understand. The legend insisted that the house fed on fear and silence, and many believed the Ravenscar family's fate was a warning about how darkness grows when ignored or concealed. Even after the structure finally collapsed under its own weight, the ground where it stood remained untouched, avoided and feared, as if something still lingered beneath the soil, waiting for someone else to step too close and awaken the nightmare once again.